What's up guys, it's Cooper Codes. In this video, we're going to take a look at the Apollo server setup for subscriptions. We are going to create a subscription to see whenever a message is sent from our Apollo server, and we are going to store messages in a MongoDB Atlas database. Let's take a look at the overall system we're going to make for this tutorial. On the left, you'll see we're going to create our Apollo server using GraphQL, and the Apollo server is going to have the functionality to send messages and also allow users to subscribe to see all the messages being sent. This is going to require us to make a message type in our GraphQL, some type of create message mutation, and then a messages subscription. So when we call create message from our Apollo server, it's going to store messages on our MongoDB server. And we'll usually make this message type have some type of basic format where there's going to have the text of the message, like subscribe, and then possibly a username, for example, Cooper Codes. Then in our MongoDB Atlas database, we're going to pretty much hold all the messages that use this create message mutation, and we are going to use Mongoose to create those models for a message type to be stored. I know that's a lot right now, and this is just a general overview, so let's get into it. So before we get into anything fun here, we have to go and make sure our MongoDB database is configured correctly, which is a pretty simple process. If you log into MongoDB, you're probably going to be presented with a screen like this, which is where you want to go. You're going to press build a database, and then you're going to want to go to shared. You might even get to this like create a database way just by logging in. Sometimes they put you to this page. So if you're here, you're in the right spot. And the good thing about this is there's no way to mess it up because there's only one way to get the free cluster. So if you're getting the free thing, you're on the right path. That's something I always tell everyone is like, if it's free, you're in the right spot. One thing is you might want to name your cluster name, so we can name it like subscription server or something like that. And that's it. As long as it's free, you're good. Then you're going to make sure to go into your username and password here. I'm going just to edit my admin password and name it Cooper Codes. I'll show you guys that. So it's admin and Cooper Codes. You're going to want to remember your username is admin and your password is whatever you determine it to be. So I'm going to update that. You're also going to want to make sure that your IP access list has something like this. This pretty much means that any IP is allowed to access your database. If it's a 0000/0, you're good. And then you can finish and close. And MongoDB is going to pretty much provision your server for a little bit. So take a break for 5 minutes and come back to the video. All right, so hopefully your server's all set up. It'll look like this eventually. Then you're going to press connect. Then you're going to press connect your application, and then you're going to want to do like full driver code example. You don't have to do this, but it helps you out. Then you're gonna want to copy this MongoDB URI. This is super important for what we want to do later. This is the way you can access your MongoDB database is just through this URI. People try to overcomplicate this step. They try and add a bunch of different random stuff, but it's literally like mongoose.connect, this URI link, and you're good to go. So copy this, keep it somewhere, we're going to use it later. One quick note before we get started is this tutorial assumes that you have Node.js installed. So if you don't have that installed, go and do that. It's going to help you out, and it's going to make sure all the npm commands we're about to use will work. Well, speaking of that, let's get started creating the project. So you're going to want to make sure you have a text editor and then a terminal. I'm using the built-in VS Code terminal, which you can grab by pulling from the bottom here, bringing it up, and now you have a terminal in your current directory, so it's pretty neat. So let's get started by doing npm init --yes. This is going to create our base package.json file, which we are going to add further dependencies on top of, so we can have all the libraries we need for the functionality of our app. So the actual list of libraries is going to be a little complicated, so I'm going to split it into two different installs. The first one, we're going to want to install Apollo server, which runs the Apollo server, surprise, and then GraphQL Subscriptions, Mongoose, and NodeMon. Then some things on top of this, we're going to want to do another npm install, and we're going to do @GraphQL-tools/schema. This is something that we're going to need for a specific function. Then we're going to do npm install subscriptions -transport-ws. And I think that covers everything. So if you go to our package.json file, you're going to find that we have all these dependencies here with our current versions. And so now we have the actual code for all these dependencies ready to be used in our project. While we are in the package.json here, I'm going to add another script called start This is pretty common. And we are going to run this script by saying npm start. So we can kind of change this however we want. And whenever we do npm start, we want it to run whatever script is in between these quotes. So we are going to say nodemon and then index.js, because index.js is a file we're going to create that is going to hold our Apollo server. All right, let's get started by creating that index.js file. Before we get into any actual code, I want to make a constant here that's going to hold that MongoDB Uri link I was discussing before. So go to your database, go to connect your application like I mentioned before, and then copy this URI link. We can paste it in here, and you're going to see the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure you have an account named admin, and then you're going to put your password here. My password was lowercase Cooper Codes, but put whatever your password was. If you copied Cooper Codes, then it should be Cooper Codes. And then this database name doesn't matter, and you should be good to go. Let's get started creating the function that we're going to use for the actual implementation of our Apollo server. So we're going to make this an anonymous asynchronous function, which is pretty much means we want to make an asynchronous function, but we don't really want to call it anywhere else besides the function itself. So this is some strange JavaScript syntax where right here is the actual asynchronous function. And if we want to call this function, we are going to add some parentheses to the end like this. These parentheses represent the function call. This represents the actual function. So if we were to go in here and log console.log hello, you'll see if I run npm start, it's going to run and do some nodemon stuff, of course, and then it's going to show that hello printing because npm start runs this index.js file. This is just showing you guys how this function is actually called. All right, so we can get rid of that hello from before and get started on actually creating our server. We're going to have to require some things from those libraries from our package.json initially. So one thing we're going to need is express, which we're going to get by saying const express is equal to require express. We're also going to need a function called create server from HTTP. This is where our subscriptions are going to live, or our subscription server is going to live. So it's going to be require HTTP. Then we're going to need the function make executable schema. This is going to come from the GraphQL tools we defined before, so GraphQL tools/schema. This allows us to make an executable schema from our type defs and our resolvers in our GraphQL. All right, so I'm not requiring everything initially, but let's go make some code with this. So we are going to save our app as a regular express here, our regular express server. And then we're going to also want to create the HTTP server that is going to pretty much use our app. A lot of this is part of the documentation of Express and HTTP server. If you're wondering where I'm getting this information from, a lot of it's part of documentation. And then we're also going to need the schema here. So const schema is equal to make executable schema. This is going to need our type defs and our resolvers. Type defs and resolvers are not defined yet, and these are variables we are going to grab from the GraphQL we're going to eventually make. So these are not defined yet, just so you guys know. All right, so this sets up the initial part of our application. We have our Express app and we have an HTTP server. Now we can get started on creating the subscription server that we're going to need to handle GraphQL subscriptions. So luckily, there is a subscription server already provided to us through one of the libraries we installed. It's under the subscriptions-transport-ws library. So this subscription server has a create function, and so we can create a server using the logic here. We're going to say const subscription server is equal to subscription server.create. And so this is going to take in two things. It's going to take the initial options here, which is going to be our schema is one of the options, and this is all from documentation, by the way. It's going to take our schema, and it's also going to take execute and subscribe. So execute and subscribe are two things we are going to need from GraphQL. So to get those things from GraphQL, you're going to want to say const execute and then subscribe. These are both coming from the GraphQL library, the GraphQL package. And so these are pretty much being passed into our subscription server saying, hey, on this server, you're going to want to be able to use the execute functionality and then the subscribe functionality. Now, in the next parameter, we're going to have the socket options. Pretty much this means our server, which we already defined above, which is the HTTP server. And then we're also going to want to have a path, which means /GraphQL. You can change this path to whatever you want, but pretty much what it means is if we have our server on localhost 4000, for example, this subscription server is going to live on localhost 4000/GraphQL. And so this can be whatever path you want. I think it makes most sense to have it be GraphQL, so we're going to put it there. Okay, so at this point we have our subscription server created here. It uses a schema and it uses a server we created here, and this server is using our app express middleware. I know that's a lot to take in and you don't have to fully understand this, but I think it's just worth a decent explanation. Okay, so now we can get started creating our actual Apollo server. We're going to want to go up here and then get the Apollo server from the Apollo server-express library. Since this is our main server, we can just call this const server, and it's going to follow a similar pattern to above, where we're going to make a new Apollo server object, and it's going to take in some parameters. One of the first parameters it's going to take is a schema, which is the same executable schema we created up here. Then it's also going to use some plugins, which is going to help us handle subscriptions. So the syntax is kind of strange, but you pretty much want to make it an array, and then you want to put an object in this array. Then we're going to define an asynchronous function here. Async server will start, just saying our server is going to start here, and we're going to want to do something on the return here, which is saying async drain server. This is another asynchronous function. Pretty much when the server will start returns eventually, you want to run this drain server code to pretty much then close your subscription server. This is some code we have to do to handle the HTTP server stuff above. Make sure our HTTP server shuts down when our Apollo server shuts down. So we kind of have to make those connections. I know this is some confusing syntax, so hopefully this is clear enough. But pretty much we're giving it a plugin, which allows us to use asynchronous functions. Now that we've fully defined our server, we're going to use await here and say server.start. It's important that we use the await keyword, and the only reason we can use the await keyword is because we made this an asynchronous function, just to make sure you guys know that. It's important because we want to make sure our server is fully started before we do anything like apply middleware or connect other things to our specific server. So next thing, we're going to say server.apply middleware. Our middleware is going to be our app or our express application. So this app is the same app as defined up here with express. Now that this middleware is defined, we are going to want to introduce Mongoose, which is going to help us connect to our MongoDB database. And so I don't believe we've required Mongoose yet. So we're going to go over here and say const Mongoose is equal to require Mongoose. Kind of a similar syntax to how we require express. And so now we can go down, and now that we have access to all the different Mongoose functionality, we can do a very simple mongoose.connect MongoDB. This is your MongoDB URI link we've defined up here. And so if this MongoDB URI link is wrong, you're going to run into issues on the connection here. So if you run into issues on connection, triple check your MongoDB URI link. And it's also important that we pass in the options to say use new URL parser true. This is a necessary thing that's shown in the MongoDB documentation. It's necessary for the connection to work. And so now we are going to have a port defined. So const port is going to be equal to, let's say 4000 for this application. And then we want to make sure our HTTP server is listening to that port. Remember, this is the same server that we're using for our subscriptions right here. So we want to make sure it's listening to all the requests that are hitting the 4000 port. And so we can say HTTP server.listen. We are going to use the port number. Then we're going to create an arrow function to pretty much do a very simple console.log. And the arrow function is expecting something. And so we can say server is now running on, I will just add port. And keep in mind, this is some syntax where we don't have to do any extra brackets. So you don't need a semicolon here. It's actually going to break. But in this syntax, we're going to pretty much have a message print server is now running on port, we can say 4000. And this is specifically our HTTP server. So let's see that. HTTP server is now running on port 4000. And so now we kind of have a basic idea of everything working. You'll see this won't work quite yet if you do npm start. The main thing that's breaking it from working right now is that our type defs and our resolvers are not defined. So now we're going to go in and create our actual GraphQL code to get started. Before actually creating our GraphQL code, we're going to want to make sure we have a Mongoose model to work with for our message. So let's create a folder called models, and then inside of models, we can create a message.js file. So this message.js file is going to be pretty simple. It's going to pretty much go in here and say, okay, we need the model And then we also need a schema object from Mongoose. And remember, Mongoose exists just to help us communicate with our MongoDB database in kind of a way that Mongoose handles. And when I say a way that Mongoose handles, I mean that Mongoose has a specific schema type that we can make our message schema with. And so you can say new schema, and then there's Mongoose documentation outlining what you're allowed to make this schema. And so inside of here, we can say new schema, and we're going to have a couple different properties. One property we're going to have is the actual text, which is going to be of type string, and then created by, which is going to be also string. This allows us to have a message like this. So we can have a text property and say, hello world, and don't ignore the red lines for now, and then created by, and we can say Cooper codes. This is kind of the same exact thing. It's just Mongoose helps us create a consistent model that's going to work in our GraphQL. So now we want to export this. So module.exports the model using the type message, or the name message, and then the actual schema behind that message. All right, so now we have a full working message.js Mongoose model we can use in the rest of our GraphQL project. All right, so let's create a folder called GraphQL to hold all of our different GraphQL files we're going to need. The two files we're going to need are our resolvers.js and then our typedefs.js. And let's capitalize typedefs like this. That's usually how they do in the documentation. So typedefs. And inside of typedefs, you're going to have all of your GraphQL typedefs. So all of the type definitions you need for your GraphQL. So inside of typedefs, we need to be able to get the actual GQL querying language from Apollo server. And so this allows us to write actual GraphQL code. And so inside of here, we want to say module.exports. So pretty much what we're going to export is all of our type definitions. And our type definitions are going to be defined as GraphQL code. And you want to make sure you have backticks surrounding this is how you kind of get into GQL, is you say GQL and then two backticks. These are like parentheses in a function almost. So anything within these two backticks is going to be GraphQL code. And you'll see if I go in here and make our first type called message, the syntax is going to look a certain way. So I have type message, and then I'm going to have the two things we need. Text, which is a string, and then created by, which is also a string. Keep in mind, just because this looks super similar to our Mongoose model, that doesn't always have to be the case. Our model is just how we store the MongoDB database. Like in our MongoDB database, we store it with the model. The actual typedef type itself is not one-to-one, but in this example, we want it to be one-to-one because in our messages in GraphQL, we want text and created by, and then in our database, we also want to store text and created by. So that's a subtle difference, but I think worth explaining. So let's go in here. We are going to have a type mutation, which is pretty much create message. So this is going to allow us to actually create our message. We're not going to define it here 100%. This is just a type definitions. We have to go into the resolvers to explain how we want these mutations defined. So we can say message input is equal to a message input type, which let's create that right now. So this is just a simple way of creating inputs for your mutations or your subscriptions, whatever you need inputs for. It's a simple way to like manage the inputs in a clean way, so you don't always have to change a lot of things around here. And so input, message input, we want a text and then also a username, part of our message input. And so that way, when we create a message, the two required fields are, okay, we want text of that message we're creating, and then we also want the username where that message is coming from. And so this create message needs to return a message. All right, so let's go over to our resolvers and actually define what this create message is going to look like. While we're here, we can also go in and make our subscriptions. And we are going to want to make a message created subscription, and it's just going to return the data of whatever message is being created. All right, so now that we have the mutation and the subscription, we can now go in and to our resolvers and define these two things. Make the actual code behind the create message and the actual code behind the message created. So this is going to follow a pretty similar syntax where we have module.exports or module.exports. So we're going to go in here, do module.exports, and we're going to have our mutations that get defined, and then also our subscriptions. So subscription gets defined. Before we actually get into this code, I want to make sure we have everything we need. So we're going to need the message model from our Mongoose. So we're going to go in and say require ... go back one, and then go to models, and then go to the actual message.js we have stored there. Okay, so this gives us access to that Mongoose model. Then I'm also going to want to go into our GraphQL Subscriptions library and grab PubSub, which is how we're going to do the publish and subscription stuff for this tutorial. So we can do require GraphQL-subscriptions here. And we want to also have a PubSub object, which we can use for the actual subscription things. So this is this new PubSub. We don't need any special options for this. We just need the regular PubSub object to be used. So let's go in here and make an asynchronous function for our create message. We can ignore the first parameter here and then go in and actually deconstruct that message input object. So this deconstruction pretty much is saying, okay, we are going to go in on our type defs. We're going to have this message input block, which looks like this. Just to give you guys an example, it looks like this. And we're going to want to say, okay, take this object and then get the actual properties of text and username outside of that object. And so now when we create this actual function, whenever we say text, like you see here, let me get rid of this. Whenever we say text, it's going, as you see lit up, it's going to reference this text from our message input here. This simplifies our code so we don't have to say like message input.text every single time. So now we can get started by creating our new message from the Mongoose model. So we're going to say new message, and this is the message that is coming from our actual Mongoose model here. And the Mongoose model requires to actually be filled up with the information we need it to be filled up with. So the actual text property of the Mongoose model is going to be the text we pass in here. And then the actual created by property is going to be the username here. And let's see here, did we use created by? Yep, just making sure. Okay, so now we have an actual Mongoose model being created and it has all of our data. And so now we can say, okay, we're going to get a result or a response from this await new message.save. This is kind of why we use the asynchronous part of this, is because we want to make sure the new message.save is 100% done before we continue trying to work with this result. And so here's where things get interesting. We can just return this regular ID is equal to the result ID, and then there's some syntax here. We can say res._doc. This is going to return an object that has the rest of our result variables, so pretty much our text and our created by, things like that. And this would actually work for creating a message. But the thing is, it wouldn't work for actually working with subscriptions. With subscriptions, we need to do a publish. And so the publish functionality comes from the PubSub object we've created above. So once this result is fully done, we can then publish that our message has been successfully created. Because this is going to also error out is an important part. So if an error hits here, we'll never publish. That's why it's important to do it in this order. And so from here, we can say, okay, let's name this something. This name, it matters, but you can actually name it whatever you want. We're going to name it message_created because that's the name of our subscription. It kind of makes sense to name it that. And this message_created requires a message created. Let's see, it actually requires, the text and the created by properties coming from the message that we want to show. So we're going to show these properties to the actual GraphQL subscription. So we want to say text is equal to text. Then we want to say created by is equal to that username. And so this is going to publish this data using the message created subscription. And you'll see I'm saying message created because it's the name of our subscription here. And that's going to help us out by publishing that message_created and then getting this subscription and then posting this data to it. And you'll see we haven't really defined the actual subscription yet. This right here is going to make way more sense. So subscription is way more simple. We're just going to do a simple message created saying, okay, we want this subscription to be defined. And it's going to pretty much use subscribe, which I believe we don't need to include. Yeah, subscribe is just a property here. And so we're going to say subscribe. And then we're going to set this equal to an arrow function. Nice and simple because it's one line. PubSub, and then there's this thing, this is part of the syntax, and you'll see it's even showing up right away because it's very commonly used. Async iterator, which pretty much means, okay, go and look for this thing and see if there's a publish that has been used with a certain tag. So these two tags, message_created, have to be the same. So the subscription is looking for any message_created things that kind of pop up. When I say pop up, have been published. So this subscription, once you're subscribed to it, you're going to be actively listening. And then as soon as this create message code hits this publish, it's going to say, boom, okay, if you're subscribed over here, show all of this data from the actual publish itself. And that's all you really need for subscriptions. And so now we've kind of created a full application here with the actual subscribe and the publish working together in unison. Now that we've actually created our type defs and our resolvers, we're going to want to go into our code and actually go and get those resolvers so we can use them here. Remember at line 18 and 19 here at type defs and resolvers, these need to be defined. So we need to define type defs above as a require statement going into our ./GraphQL /resolver, typedefs.js. This goes to that file and it gets that module.exports from that file right here, for example. And so now we can go to our resolvers, say const resolvers is equal to require ./GraphQL /resolvers.js. Same exact concept is it's going into the resolvers.js. It's going into the resolvers and it's taking a look here and it's going to the module.exports and getting all the necessary information here. All right, hold up. So there's one important thing I actually forgot about in this tutorial, which we can make a real quick fix to, is that our type defs actually needs to have at least one query defined for it to be chill and actually work. If you run this code right now, it's going to give you an error pretty much saying that the query root type must be provided, etc. So let's make a basic query that's just going to get our message by its ID. So we can say type query, and we're going to say message, and then it's going to have an ID parameter, which is going to be an ID, and we can return a message here. And so this isn't really a tutorial on GraphQL queries, more about the subscriptions. So I'm not going to go into super huge depth here, but it's pretty much going to be a pretty simple one-line query where we can go to our resolvers. We want to add the queries and go in here and say, okay, take that message that we just defined before and kind of make a one-liner function, which gives us the ID as a parameter. And then it's going to be a simple arrow function saying, okay, message, and this is pointing at the message Mongoose model, by the way, which gives us a function .find by ID, and then you can pass in that ID from our query. And so this is going to allow us to have at least one query exist inside of our GraphQL code. And this is a nice little addition because it also shows how to add queries as well if you ever want to do that. So now if we go in here, we already have this code working, do an npm start, it should start our server right up. Okay, so HTTP server is now running on port 4000. This is great. That means our subscription server is up and we kind of have some code ready to go here, which is just great. So we can actually go into our terminal, or sorry, not our terminal. We can go to localhost 4000 on our actual computers here. So let's go to localhost 4000 /GraphQL, and it's going to allow us to actually communicate with our server. So you'll see I probably already have some stuff written down here. So let's see. The mutations are going to allow us to actually add data to our MongoDB Atlas database. And so in the actual MongoDB Atlas database, we can make a mutation to create a message. And so let's see here. This is pretty much some basic syntax. The new GraphQL sandbox has made it really easy to make these queries. You just like click on things and it builds things for you. But I'll explain this mutation really quick where it says, okay, mutation, take a message input, which is the type of the message input block. And then this variable is defined in our variables down here. And so that's how the message input block comes into play. It needs that text and it needs that username property. And so I'm going to make the text subscribe to Cooper Codes. You definitely should do that. And it's coming from Cooper Codes, so it's definitely an unbiased source. And so we're going to go to the create message mutation, and then we're going to pass in those parameters. And so if we run this mutation, it's going to give us a response, which is great. That means it actually ran through our code. We can go to our database and then go to our actual collections. So browse collections, and this is how you can see the actual data in your database. And as you'll see, I sent this message before, so ignore that. But we have this new message, subscribe to Cooper Codes, created by Cooper Codes. And just to make sure this is it, we can do like 123, 123 at the end, just change the message up, do another mutation, go back to your database, refresh, and you're going to have a 123, 123 message. And so that's sent here. So this is great, but we're not using the actual subscriptions yet. So take this GraphQL Explorer and make a new tab with the new Explorer here. So we can go in here, add the subscription, add the message created field, and add the text. and the created by. So it's pretty much saying run this subscription. It's the message created subscription, and then get the text and created by variables whenever we receive a message from this subscription. We can keep the variables here. I'm not sure it's going to give us an error for that. Yep. Okay, so it's just going to ignore these variables even though they exist, so it's totally fine. And this is now running a subscription. And so the idea of subscriptions is that whenever we run the mutation create message over here, I'm going to say, let's change this to this is a subscription message. We can run this mutation. We receive the actual response back, which is great. Like I said before, it means we have no errors. We can go over here and see that we actually received the data from our subscription. If we just name this text like 1, something simple, I can send this in, and you'll see it's going to show 1 over here. And if I send in this over here, I'd say text is now 2. I'm going to run the mutation, which is like, posting a, text message. And I can go in here and take a look and say there is the, the 2. And so this is super great. This means that as we run this create message mutation, we're actually able to subscribe and see all the different type of things that are happening, or all the different types of messages that are happening whenever create message is called. Another great point here is that if we make another tab, we can also subscribe over here. So now we have 2 different users subscribing to the subscription. And so I'm going to name the text, this should be sent to both users. I'm also going to be Cooper codes again, and so I can send this mutation, and you'll see this should be sent to both users. So we have a response over on this subscription, then we also have a response over on this subscription. And so this is super great news. Also, the entire time, we'll refresh this MongoDB Atlas. The entire time, all these random messages I've been sending have been saved to the database. So this is actually super cool to see everything here, but it's also super cool to see the subscriptions working in parallel with the saving to the database. And so yeah, that's pretty much the tutorial. I hope this has been kind of helpful in understanding how these subscriptions actually work. Obviously, this was a very simple example using a message. I think in future tutorials, I'm going to kind of consider making things like chat rooms possibly. You'll see that this subscription is pretty broad. It's going to look at any message created. There are ways to make subscriptions so you can only look at messages created under a certain ID. For example, if you're in like chat room 10, you only want to see messages created in chat room 10. And there's actually ways to do that in GraphQL. So if you're interested in that, make sure to comment below. Subscribe if you want. I'm going to continue making content like this, especially during the winter break here. So thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed.